So my name is Dylan Thayer. You all probably know me as the Parish Coordinator here at St. Paul's K Street, which is something I'm really proud of and really great. I'm also a graduate of Vanderbilt University Law School and Hamilton College, which Nancy Work continually reminds me is very, very important. Thank you, Nancy. So at Hamilton, I actually majored in religious studies and classical languages, and I started doing research on a project that would eventually become my first book about Moses, which is going to be published hopefully someday. And that is why Father Richard made the interesting choice of trusting me to lead this presentation, which is the first class in our series called The Outlaw Divine. Which, as I hinted at in my prayer, is about people who pushed the boundaries of what we believe and continue to believe about God. I'm going to be presenting this first class. Christopher Poore will be doing a class, Father Richard will be doing a class, and Dr. Orens will be doing a class. So a lot of exciting stuff coming up. Now, I'm going to share my screen with you all now so you can see. I've put together a little PowerPoint presentation for us tonight. Before I start, though, I want to ask you guys, like I said, I want this to be participatory. I'd like to explore what all of you think when you hear the word Moses. What's the first thing that comes into your mind? I mean, he's a very well-known guy. He's extremely well-known. I find it hard to believe that people are coming in here totally blank slate, don't know anything about Moses. So just shout it out. What's the first word that comes into your mind when you hear the name Moses?
Egypt.
Law.
Egypt, law. Those are some good ones. Anything else? Anybody have any others?
River Jordan.
The River Jordan. Okay, cool. That's a great one. I think I heard something else over there.
Yeah, patient and persevering.
Patient, persevering. Great.
The 10 Commandments.
The 10 Commandments. I think I heard another one. Arnita, I think you had one. Emancipation. That's a great one. That's a really, really, really great one.
Burning Bush.
Burning Bush. Another winner. Another $64,000 one. That's a good one. Anybody have any other ones?
Ed said holy.
Holy. That's a good one. That's a nice one. That's nice. We always try to be holy around here at St. Paul's. That's a good one. What about, like, what's your mental image of him? What does he look like? What is he doing?
Leading, wise.
Leading, wise. What is he like? What's his physical appearance like?
He's old.
He's very old. Very old. Okay, that's a good one. That's a common one.
Sometimes he's very hesitant, though, when he's arguing with God about, I'm not up to the job of taking the people out.
Yeah, that's great, Tina. That really is true, actually. That is very true about him. He can be very hesitant. This gets into one of my other questions, sort of what kind of person is Moses? What's he like? What is he doing? What are some adjectives you would use to describe him?
Leader.
Leader. That is technically a noun, but I will accept it. That's a very good one. That's a very, very good one. What else?
Loner.
Temptation, loner, those are good ones.
Distant.
Interesting.
Courageous.
Courageous. That's a good one too. That's a really good one.
Impatient.
Any more? Patient.
Impatient.
Oh, impatient. Okay. So the opposite of patient.
Mm-hmm.
I missed the important two words at the beginning, or 2 letters at the beginning of that one.
Quick-tempered. Has a temper.
He has a temper.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to talk about that tonight. He does have a temper. That shows up a few times. So I put together some of a lot of this stuff you guys hit on, some of it you didn't hit on. I put together this slide right here, talks about sort of contemporary images of Moses. A lot of you guys talked about Moses when he was a adult. I think people sometimes think of Moses as being a baby too. See him here, like he looks kind of cute. He's floating around. Miriam's right over there, kind of not really sure what's going to happen to him now that this Egyptian woman has noticed him. He's an Israelite. He's a Hebrew. He's Jewish. He's a Jewish icon. He has a loving sister right over here. He has a weepy mother who's really, really sad that he's not going to be hanging out with her anymore. This woman, Pharaoh's daughter, saves him. And then a lot of you guys focused on kind of the grown up, like big, powerful, successful Moses. He's a liberator. Arnita used the word emancipator, which I think is, like, frankly, an even better word, an even more apt word than liberator. He's a leader. I forget exactly who. Someone did specifically say leader. No one mentioned that he has a beard. I was really hoping that someone was going to say, because that's the image of Moses that people always have. Charlton Heston, the Ten Commandments, got a big old beard. Nobody
Right,
said,
white.
nobody
white
said
bearded.
beard. Yeah, nobody said that. He's very old. Nancy did say that, so good job, Nancy. Well done. Lawgiver, someone said law, or people said the Ten Commandments. So yeah, he's a prophet. Nobody said that. Somebody might have said something similar to that. So these are all the images that we have of Moses. He's important. He kind of knows what he's doing. He's successful. He's kind of got it all together. So these are all the kind of preconceived ideas that we have about Moses. And all of these are important in their own way. And they're all true in their own way. He was an emancipator. He was a liberator. He was a great leader. He did write laws. He was a prophet. He was very important. He was very successful. And he did have a beard, and he was very old, eventually, at some point. And also, we talked about holy. We talked about godly. He did eventually become a really holy, godly guy. But as I've hinted at, in my use of the word eventually, he didn't really start out this way. This isn't really an accurate picture of Moses for much of his life, just like our image of Moses as a baby tells us nothing about the man he eventually became. Our image of Moses that we see right here, where he's very old, very successful, got the 10 Commandments in hand, he knows what he's doing, that skips over a really, really big portion of his life. A portion when he wasn't very successful, didn't really know what he was doing, had very little direction, and appeared to all of his contemporaries to be a giant, huge, enormous screw-up. I would use a different word, but this is a church event, so I can't do that. So we don't really have time to talk about Moses the baby tonight. We'll do so briefly, just because we kind of have to, as you'll see. And I'm not going to talk about Moses the old successful man either, because those ends of Moses' life have kind of been done to death. What I'd like to talk about is the portion of his life that isn't analyzed so much. The portion of his life where Moses was kind of a failure. But like I said, in order to do that, we need to start at the beginning. So Moses was born in around between 1270 and 1260 BC. He was born right here in the huge, enormous, vast Egyptian empire. Egypt wasn't just a country at this point. It controlled a huge, huge territory that stretched from what is now the Sudan down in the south to southern Turkey way up here, over 2,000 miles, and more than 5 million people lived there. It was the biggest country in the history of the world up until this point. This right here is the Nile Delta, and around this area, as we'll see later, is where Moses and his family lived. Now, this is the guy who ran the whole thing. This is Ramesses the Great. On the left, in this statue, is how he envisioned himself. In the middle is a modern reconstruction of what he probably looked like. And here is what he's doing now. At the beginning of his reign, Ramesses built a huge new city dedicated to himself. It was called Per-Ramesses Anaktu, which in English means House of Ramesses, Great in Victory. So it was pretty much all about himself. But the city did live up to its name. Here's a modern drawing of what it likely looked like. If anything, this kind of undersells how big and vast and glorious it was. There were sparkling temples, huge fortresses, rooms where the floor was covered entirely in gold dust. Ramesses' palace at the center of the city was over 4 square miles, and it was right on the Nile. So there were canals and plazas and balconies overlooking the river. It was sort of like an Egyptian version of Venice. It was a beautiful, huge, amazing city. And there were 400,000 people who lived there. It was by far the largest city in the world at the time. It was by far the largest city anyone had built up to that point. Now, the problem for Ramses was cities don't build themselves. You need laborers. And that's where Moses and his family and his extended family, the Israelites, enter the story. Now, the Israelites, as you can see back here on this slide, had been living in Egypt in this northern area of the Nile Delta for about 3.5 centuries, 4 centuries when Moses was born. And they really actually didn't mind it. Like, we have this image that Israelite life in Egypt was horrible the entire time, but it really wasn't. For most of the time, it was fine. Ramesses is the one who changed all that. Ramesses wanted to build his huge new city right in the Israelites' backyard. And to build a city, like I said, you need laborers. And so you know what happened next. The Israelite slavery in Egypt probably only lasted about 10 to 15 years by the time that Moses was born. It had only been going on a relatively short time. And at that point, that's when we first meet the guy who's eventually going to become the liberator. That's when Moses' mother pushes him down the Nile in a basket, and he ends up kind of floating near one of these palaces over here somewhere, and he's met by Pharaoh's daughter. So what do we know about this woman? Sorry, went too far. What do we know about this woman who Moses encounters? She's introduced, like I said, in the Bible as Pharaoh's daughter. But the Egyptian word for daughter, zat, was used in ancient Egypt to indicate a close relationship. One woman might say to another woman, or a man might say to a woman that she was his or her daughter, to just indicate that there was a very close bond between the two. So this is almost certainly not a woman who's actually biologically Pharaoh's daughter. It's just someone who has really, really close connections with the royal court, who's really in with the movers and the shakers in Per-Ramesses. So that's one of the women that we meet early in Moses' life. And then there, of course, there's the woman who put him in the basket, his mother. And there's the woman who watches over the basket, his sister. Moses' mother was a woman named Jochebed. She was an Israelite, and her husband, Amram, was an Israelite as well. And they both have classic Israelite, Hebrew, Jewish names. But they had 3 children. I've mentioned 2 of them. One of them was, of course, Moses himself. Moses has an Egyptian name. Maybe that's not so surprising because he was adopted by a woman who's called Pharaoh's daughter. But his sister, Miriam, actually has an Egyptian name too. And his brother, Aaron, who we haven't met, but who will eventually become Moses' spokesman, and later on he'll be Israel's first high priest, he also has an Egyptian name. So you have an Israelite mom, an Israelite dad, 2 Israelite parents. All 3 of their children have Egyptian names. So what's going on here? Why, if we have 3 children with Egyptian names, are they paired with 2 Israelite parents? Why would 2 Israelite parents give their children 3 Egyptian names? I think in order to wrap our minds around what's going on here, it's important to sort of look at this from a modern perspective. That's where my next slide comes in, which unfortunately I jumped the gun on. So let's look at this guy on the left over here. Does anyone know who that is? Someone can just shout it out. It might be hard. Yes, thank you, Andrew. Thank you. I appreciate that. That's Mario Cuomo. He used to be the governor of New York. He was the governor of New York in the 80s and 90s, as most of you probably know. He is a first generation son of Italian immigrants. He has an Italian name, Mario Cuomo. You know, he's a good Italian. Who's this guy in the center? More of you probably know who this guy is.
Andrew.
Yes, that's Andrew Cuomo, disgraced former New York governor Andrew Cuomo. Notice that his name is Andrew. Andrew, not Andrea. Andrew. Think that's just a one-off? Who's this other guy?
Chris. Brother.
Yes. Yes, I think many of you said it. That's Chris Cuomo.
Yeah.
That's Mario's other son, disgraced CNN talk show host, Chris Cuomo. His name is not Cristoforo. It's Christopher. Christopher. It's an English name. This guy is Italian. Or he's descended from Italians, and he's the first Italian who's descended from Italians to live in America. He has 2 sons. They don't have Italian names. They have English names. One of them is named Andrew, not Andrea. One of them is named Christopher, not Cristoforo. We see this all the time throughout history. It's a fairly common pattern. Immigrants and people in minority cultures who want to give their children a leg up in life, a head start, will assimilate to the majority culture in all manner of ways. And we have lots of records, archaeological records from Egypt around the time of Moses, where other families, not just Jochebed and Amram and their children, are doing similar things. So we often think of Jochebed and Amram, we often think of Moses' mother and father as being like these poor, weepy parents who were so persecuted who couldn't do anything about what was going on with their son. Actually, they were social climbers. They were people who were trying to give their children every conceivable advantage that they could in life, starting with their names. But, of course, they didn't stop with their names. What do modern Washington, D.C. parents do for their children when they want to give them a leg up in life? What do they do?
Send them to private school.
They get them into the best schools. Yes, exactly. They pull strings. They call in favors. They say, you owe me one. Make sure my kid gets into Georgetown Prep or wherever. They make sure that their kids get into the best schools. And that's exactly what Amram and Yochebed did with Moses. Pharaoh's daughter, we just learned, was a wealthy, powerful, important, well-connected Egyptian woman. She had access to important institutions that Amram and Yochebed didn't. So Amram and Yochebed arranged for Pharaoh's daughter to adopt Moses. This happened when he was about, I'm going to say, he was around 3 years old. The Bible says that it happened when he was weaned. So he would have been about 3 or so years old. And once he was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, Moses was put into an Egyptian educational institution called the Royal Nursery. Here's a modern idea of what that looked like. It was part of the royal palace, so it would have been close to the Nile. The Royal Nursery was a place where youths born to princes, powerful people, court officials obtained a world-class education. It was the premier educational institution in the world at the time. It was the best school around. I don't know what the best high school in the DC area is. People argue about that. I'm not going to get into it. Imagine what you think the best high school in the best private school in the country is. That's the equivalent of where Moses was going. Pharaohs actually, though, didn't set up the Royal Nursery because they really cared about education. The reason why the Royal Nursery came into existence is because pharaohs wanted princes' sons from subjugated areas of the empire to get shipped off to the Royal Nursery so that they would learn about Egypt, make Egyptian friends, and stop identifying with their native culture. They also wanted to be able to keep them as hostage in case their fathers got any ideas about rebelling. So these were the advantages and disadvantages of growing up in the Royal Nursery. On the one hand, you got access to the best education in the world. You got face time with important, powerful people. You got the first choice of really plum jobs. On the other hand, it was an institution specifically designed to instill an Egyptian perspective into its students. It was an instrument of what we would today call forced assimilation, where people are taken from one group at an early age and forced to identify with another group. And if you think that that's, not very trivial, that's part of the UN's definition of genocide. So it really was something that was very much a mixed bag for the non-Egyptian kids who had to participate in it. So what did Moses learn at school all day? Ancient Egyptian scribal education was mostly route memorization of hieroglyphs, which are the building block of the ancient Egyptian writing system. So our modern alphabet is called the Roman alphabet, and everyone knows how many characters are in the alphabet, right? Let's just all shout it out at once. Ready? 1, 2, 3. 26. 26. There are 26 characters in the Roman alphabet. And this is the kind of thing where you can't memorize it, or excuse me, you can't intuit it. You have to know it. You can't deduce on your own what the letter A is. It doesn't work like that. You have to memorize it. And it's the same thing with Egyptian hieroglyphs. Anyone want to take a guess as to how many Egyptian hieroglyphs there are?
Hundreds.
Hundreds, yeah, hundreds, a lot of hundreds, at least 700.
Wow.
At least 700 is how many Egyptologists have discovered. And again, you have to memorize these. You can't just sort of guess it's a bird when actually it's a crocodile. You have to memorize what they all are. And so that's what Moses and his classmates did all day long for most of their lives for years on end. They would read and copy and recopy and recopy and recopy sign after sign after sign under their teacher's supervision. And so in addition to being tedious, life in the royal nursery could also be very brutal. Unlike modern educators, Egyptian scribes didn't really want their pupils to think for themselves. Thinking for yourself is kind of an added burden when you're having to memorize hundreds of things all day long for years. So this whole modern idea of like, we want our students to be able to solve problems and think for themselves, Egyptian teachers would have looked at us like we were crazy. They're like, no, we don't want students to think for themselves. We want students to think the way I tell them to think. That's how what education is supposed to be. There's a collected saying of teachers and wise people from this period on a papyrus that we found. And there's a little pithy line in there. It goes, "A boy's ear is on his back. He hears when he is beaten." So this was a very violent, strict, disciplinary way of learning things. And this was the stifling environment that Moses grew up in all day long, many days, for 17 years, until finally he decided to take a step outside this environment and experience what life was like for Israelites who didn't have some of the educational advantages that he had. So now I'm going to need our readers. We're going to be reading from Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 through 22. I believe I assigned Tina and Andrew and Nancy, right? Is that right? Do I have that right?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So Andrew, I know you might have to go soon, so why don't you start us out? You're going to be reading our first section of the reading, which is Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. Obviously, people are free to follow along. And like I said, we will read this in sections, so there will be time to ask questions, and I'll offer commentary as we're going through it. Take us away, Andrew.
And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown that he went out unto his brethren and looked on their burdens and spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand.
Thank you, Andrew. What's everyone's reaction to this section of our reading?
He was a murderer.
Yes. Yes, that's true. So I guess we don't feel. Sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
Because he looked to make sure no one was catching him. So he knew he was doing something unhonorable.
Yeah.
He didn't want witnesses.
Yup. He did not.
Dylan,
So I guess yes, Tina.
Was Moses aware all the time that he was in the household of Pharaoh that he was an Israelite?
Yes. There's sort of this tradition in modern retellings of Moses' life, the 10 Commandments, the Prince of Egypt, things like that, that Moses isn't aware that he's Israelite, and then he finds out, and it's shocking. But, there's no sense in the biblical story that he doesn't know that he's Israelite. In fact, quite the opposite. It says right here, he went out to his people. Doesn't seem to indicate that he's ignorant of who he is. That's a great question, Tina. Anybody got any other questions? I have a question. Nobody else has one. Why did Moses do this? Like, why would you kill this guy? Anybody have any ideas?
Well, he was loyal to his people and he was troubled by it. It hurt him. He had been beaten too in his schooling.
I guess he's just really anti-beating.
Yeah, but the kill.
And he had a speech impediment, which is probably, one might guess, let me put it that way, a result of this very harsh education.
I thought someone else had something to say. We've heard a lot from Nancy and Tina and Andrew. Did someone else have something to offer?
I wonder if he had an innate sense of justice.
I was thinking justice too.
Yeah, that's quite possible. I think it's easy to look at what's going on here and say this is unjust, this is unfair. At the same time, though, I think it's fair to ask, you know, we all have, many people seem to have a pretty visceral reaction to this. If we feel like what the Egyptians are doing is unjust and unfair, do we approve of what Moses has done?
That's uncivilized, you know, you did just kill.
Who said that? Is that Arnita?
Right.
It's uncivilized. It's uncouth.
Right.
We don't like it. Why is it uncivilized?
It's a sin to kill.
Just to kill, you know, without, could have been disciplined some kind of way, then unless it was unavoidable that he had to kill him.
What about this Egyptian guy? I mean, do we think that this Egyptian guy is like really enthused about slavery? Do we think he's like going to bed every night wearing "Let's enslave the Israelites" pajamas? No, he's a cog in the machine, just like a lot of other people. He's like an average guy just trying to make it through life. So I think what Arnita said is really true. It just sort of smacks of being unfair to just kill this guy without really thinking about what role is he playing and what's going on here.
I would wonder, Dylan, if he's also thinking that he's a protector. He's seen slaves being abused, and as an Egyptian, he is maybe taking the law in his own hands and somehow maybe protecting them.
That's a good point. Maybe this guy is really bad. Maybe he is just like, I mean, that sometimes happens in modern reconstructions of the story where people want to feel like Moses is maybe not so bad. Like we see that in the Prince of Egypt, where like the guy's just really like wailing and wailing and wailing and wailing and wailing on the guy, and then finally Moses steps in to make sure he doesn't get killed. But there's no real indication of that here. It says the Hebrew's getting beaten, not beaten within an inch of his life, not the overseer's going to kill him. It's possible, I guess, but this just sort of seems like a routine beating. I mean, probably sadly happened a lot in this regime. All right, we need to move on to our next section of the reading. So that's Nancy, who's going to be doing Exodus 2 verses 13 through 15.
When he went out the next day, he saw two Hebrews fighting, and he said to the one who was in the wrong, "Why do you strike your fellow Hebrew?" He answered, "Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses.
What's your reaction to this section? Anybody have any knee-jerk reactions?
Busted.
What'd you say?
Said busted.
Oh yeah.
People know.
Yeah, I think someone said earlier, I think it was you, Andrew. You said, you know, he really looked around, made sure there were no witnesses. Well, I guess he didn't look very hard because it seems like pretty much everybody knows about it.
Well, if he thought he was in the right, there would have been no reason to try to hide the situation.
Well, that's true. That's true. It's true. You don't really hide something if you think you're doing the right thing. That's usually true.
Also, it's a interesting foretaste of the fact that he does become an officer and judge over them later.
Yes. Yes, and actually, I know that this is not directly related to what we're talking about tonight, but ironically, when Moses is an officer and a judge over the Israelites, they still say the exact same thing to him. They still
Right.
say, "Who appointed you in charge of us?" So, yes, it's true, Tina. This is just a first taste
Hey,
for him. What do you guys think about? But so the Israelites do object to Moses kind of having this self-appointed extrajudicial role. What do you guys think about that? Why do they object?
Because he had privilege,
Mm-hmm.
privileges they didn't have.
Mm-hmm. Kind of got a silver spoon stuck in his mouth.
Right, right.
He might not have also been raised as a Jewish boy who learned the ways of Judaism.
So he wasn't really in with them. Is that what you're saying, Deb? Like he's not really a part of the group.
No, he wasn't raised that way. He probably had to learn about the Egyptian gods.
That's quite possible, yeah.
So I don't know that he got any other education from his mother or his brother or his sister.
He was a baby when he was separated.
Mm-hmm.
He went to an Egyptian school.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
he
that's
can't, he can't have been raised as an Israelite. I mean, as a Jew.
that's true. That's a good point, Jenny. Yeah, I mean, I think what sorry, Tina, go ahead.
That he didn't belong in either camp. Not really totally Egyptian, not really an Israelite.
Yeah,
Right.
somehow he knew he was one of them,
One of who?
that they were his people.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying he knew he was one of the Israelites,
Yeah.
but they didn't really, but they said, yeah, nah, I don't think so. You're not one of us. All right. Okay. All right. We're going to do our final section of the reading. Who's our last reader? I believe that's you, Tina. So
Yeah.
you're going to read till we get to Exodus 22 or Exodus you're not going to read 20 chapters. You're going to read until we get to Exodus you're going to read until we get to Exodus 2:22. How about that? Sounds good.
Okay. When Pharaoh heard of it, he tried to put Moses to death, but Moses made good his escape and settled in the land of Midian. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. One day, as Moses sat by a well, they came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's sheep. Some shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses got up, took the girls' part, and watered their sheep himself. When the girls came back to their father Reuel, he asked, "How is it that you are back so quickly today?" "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds," they answered, "and he even drew water for us and watered the sheep." "But where is he then?" he said to his daughters. "Why did you leave him behind? Go and invite him to eat with us." So it came about that Moses agreed to live with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah in marriage. She bore him a son, and Moses called him Gershom, because he said, "I have become an alien living in a foreign land."
Wow.
Mm.
Thank you, Tina. Any reactions, questions, comments?
Sort of like Jacob and Rachel or
Rebecca.
Rebecca. Yeah, Rebecca.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that
Or was it Isaac and Rebecca? Isaac's servant and
Isaac and Rebecca, yeah. Yeah. And Jacob and
Rachel.
Rachel. I think one of the interesting things about Zipporah though is that unlike Rachel, unlike Rebecca, unlike Sarah, unlike the patriarchs' wives, she doesn't really have a personality. She doesn't really have an identity outside of being Moses' wife. She's mentioned only 4 times in the Bible. And unlike the wives of the patriarchs, Moses never raves about her beauty. Moses never says, like, oh my gosh, Zipporah is so amazing. That never happens. They don't seem to have had an especially close, rosy relationship. And maybe the beginning of that relationship is the reason for that. I mean, Moses didn't go to Midian to meet Zipporah. It's not like with Isaac and Rebecca and Isaac's servant, where Abraham specifically says, you're going to get my son a wife, because I don't want him marrying any of these gross Canaanite women around here. You're going to go get him a real wife back where I'm from. No, Moses flees to Midian, which you can see on the map right here. So this is P. Ramses. This is where the Israelites lived. I know it says Goshen down here. That's wrong. It should be up here. I got this map off the internet. I'm not that good at making maps. I did draw this giant purple line, though, which shows the route that Moses probably took in order to get into Midian. I also drew this black line. This black line, can anyone tell me what that is? It was I actually showed it to you earlier. It was on one of the maps we saw earlier. Anybody have any ideas?
Is that the wilderness?
That black line, it's kind of like the wilderness. That black line is basically the limit of Egyptian imperial control. They maybe had some control like down on the Gulf of Aqaba down there, but basically this is the limit of the Egyptian empire. So by going to Midian, Moses is trying to get himself as far outside of Egyptian power as he possibly can. He's leaving home and he's not coming back. He's leaving Egypt forever. He has no intention to return. Midian is the place where you go when you don't ever want to run into an Egyptian imperial official again. That's where you go. So what is Midian? So Midian is not a land, it's a group of people. The Midianites were a league of tribes, just like the Israelites, actually. The Israelites have 12 tribes. They have a tribal structure underneath sort of a national structure. Midianites were the same way. Unlike the Israelites at this time, though, the Midianites were nomadic, and they lived over here in what is now northwest Saudi Arabia. They sometimes wandered up here into what is now Jordan and Israel. And you can see on this next slide that I'm about to show you that Midian and Egypt are very different geographically. Hold on.
How far is it from, how far did he go to get to Midian?
Oh, this is hundreds of miles. It's probably a journey of about 250, 300 miles. It's a long trip. So this is an ancient Midianite shrine. This is another Midianite landscape. And then this is some pottery from Midian from the time that Moses was alive. So this is what Egypt looks like. This is from the Nile Delta, which is where Ramses was built and where Moses lived and where Goshen is. Very rich, very fertile. This is Midian. Really dry, really barren. Nothing grows out there. Very, very different geographically. Moses has left basically everything that he knows behind. He's left his family behind. He's left his school behind. He's left the very physical landscape that he knows behind. Now, there's something interesting that the girls that Moses meets say about him. Did you guys notice it? What did they call him?
They called him Egyptian.
Right. Right. They didn't say an Israelite helped us against the shepherds. They said an Egyptian helped us. We think of Moses as being an Israelite leader. But in this section of the text, and at this point in his life, as we've talked about earlier, he's basically Egyptian, which means that he looks very different than the image all of us have of him. This is an Egyptian man from a tomb painting from the roughly the era of Moses. Look at the kilt he's wearing. He's weighing some gold and also a ox figurehead on a scale. He has a shaved head, no beard. He has kohl eye makeup around his eyes to protect them from the sun. That's what Moses looked like. That's what he would have been wearing. Here's another great image. This is also from a tomb painting. It shows that this is actually probably much closer to what Moses looked like because he was an upper class man too. Notice this guy is also wearing a kilt. He has a bracelet. He has a series of elaborate neck gear around his neck, a collar of some kind. Notice what he has on his head. That is not his hair. That is a wig. Upper class Egyptian men from this period wore wigs or headdresses, or they went bald. We don't know what Moses was wearing when he showed up in Midian. Down here, you can see these are the sorry, I accidentally muted myself. These are the Egyptian royal headdresses. These are the crowns that the pharaohs would wear. Of course, Moses never wore that. I just thought that it would be good to have some fancy extra things. I know we like to be fancy and extra here at St. Paul's. So just thought I would let you guys see that. But you get the point from these crowns. This is what fashion of the era was like for Egyptian men. You were totally shaven up top and on your beard and on your mustache. And you wore a kilt. Your belly was exposed. If you were upper class wealthy, you'd have like some nice collars on, maybe some nice bracelets. Maybe you'd have a nice headdress, or you'd have a wig, or you'd go bald. So we think of Moses as looking like this. But this is really what he looked like when he showed up in Midian. Not exactly. We don't know exactly what fashion choices Moses was wearing that day, and he was probably not like as healthy and bronzed as this guy because he's just been schlepping himself through the desert. So he's probably really thirsty and really cranky and doesn't look so great. But that is a lot closer to what he looked like than Charlton Heston. So we've hinted at this issue earlier on, which is that Moses is Egyptian at this point, but he was born an Israelite. This dual identity thing is still bothering him. And in addition, the Bible hints in a later passage that Moses didn't speak Hebrew very well. Some people have put that down to a speech impediment or some kind of disability. I don't think so. I think it's a symptom of the fact that from the time when he was 3 years old, he grew up in an Egyptian environment, learning Egyptian, being forced to speak Egyptian. And so he probably could speak Israelite, like, you know, obviously we can see from the story he spoke Israelite well enough to be able to communicate with some Israelites. But he could probably speak Egyptian a lot better. He was identified. Sorry, what did you say, Edie?
How did he learn to speak Hebrew?
Well, he was born into a Hebrew household, and he probably saw his mother and his family sometimes. Babies have a very innate gift for language. So from the time when he was 1 to the time when he was 3, he spoke Hebrew with his mom, and then he went off to the Royal Nursery and he was taught how to speak Egyptian.
You wouldn't have a very big vocabulary at age 3.
Right, which is why my theory is that when at the burning bush, when Moses says to God that he can't speak very well, that's not because he has a speech impediment, it's because he hasn't learned much Israelite, which is why God says, okay, fine, like I understand you don't know all the super high fancy Anglican words in Israelite, so I'll get your brother Aaron who knows all those words and he'll teach them and it'll be fine. It's not because he can't talk well. It's because he didn't learn Israelite.
He didn't
And
have
God
the
could only speak.
vocabulary.
Sorry, what?
God only understood Hebrew.
Couldn't speak Egyptian. Well,
I guess that's why God never talks to me, because I don't speak Israelite or Egyptian. Maybe someday. Maybe someday. Speaking of which, you may have noticed something important that we haven't mentioned to this point. We talked about it just now. What have we not mentioned in Moses' story so far?
Well, what became of his children?
Well, no, we've mentioned that. We've talked about his children a little bit. There is something in Moses' story that has literally not been mentioned at all in his life up until this point.
God.
God, yes, who said that?
Yeah.
Deb, give yourself a big pat on the back. God, yeah, we haven't heard about God at all. This is Moses. We haven't heard about God once in this whole thing. He's nowhere to be found in Moses' life up to this point. We don't hear about God when Moses is floating in the basket. We don't hear about God when Moses is adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. We don't hear about God when he kills the Egyptian. We don't hear about God when he flees to Midian. We don't hear about God when he meets the priest of Midian and his daughters. We don't hear about God when he gets married. We don't hear about God when he gets a kid. God is entirely absent, seemingly, from the narrative and from Moses' life up until this point.
Seemingly.
Right, seemingly.
Moses is, to all
He set the
appearances,
whole thing up.
he's a secularly minded person. He never says, hey, you know what? I'm going out and I'm going to kill the Egyptian because God told me to. He doesn't say that.
Right.
He's a person who is living his life seemingly unconcerned with God. He's as unconcerned with God as one can be in the ancient world when people were very concerned with God, or gods, as the case may be. And how are things going for Moses at this point in his life? Not great, actually. By my calculations, Moses is about 20 years old when he ends up in Midian. The Bible says he's 40. If you want to know why he's actually 20, it's kind of complicated. We can talk about it later. I'm happy to talk about it. Moses has spent the first 3 years of his life in an Israelite home, and then he spent the next 17 years learning how to be an Egyptian, to the point where everyone thinks he's an Egyptian, to the point where he cannot even speak his native tongue at a confident level anymore. By the standards of the world, Moses is a huge success. He's at a top school. He's going to have a long, successful career. But my theory is, and a lot of you actually mentioned this, my theory is there was something about that just didn't feel right to Moses. He felt like a fraud. He didn't feel Egyptian, but he didn't really feel Israelite either. Killing the Egyptian is the desperate act of an angry, frustrated, pissed off teenager, basically. The Egyptian empire is not going to end because one overseer is dead. The Israelites are not going to be free because one overseer is dead. Moses is book smart enough to know that, even if he's not yet emotionally smart enough to know that at this point in his life. And as a result of his lack of emotional smarts, Moses spent the next 20 years tending sheep in Midian. He takes his education and the connections and the advantages that he had, and he throws them all away. For now, anyway. He spends his days living and working in a place that ancient Egyptians thought of as totally backward. A good modern comparison for what Moses has done with his life would be someone going to Harvard undergrad and Yale Law School, and then deciding, you know what? I'm going to spend my life working at a gas station in Alaska. Not that there's anything, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I am not saying there's anything wrong with that. But I think we underestimate when we read this story because we don't have the knowledge and context that ancient people had when they read it. That is basically what Moses has done. But if we look at the biblical text, something really interesting happens. You see, in the text narrative structure, the very moment when the world has given up on Moses, the very moment that he's seemingly taken all his education and all his advantages and thrown it away, is the moment when something extraordinary begins to happen to him. Here, I'm going to read the very next verses in the Bible after Moses' son Gershom is born. After he's settled in Midian for good, after he's given up all thought of returning to Egypt. This is from Exodus chapter 2, 23 and 24. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. The very next chapter in the story is Exodus 3. That's the chapter when God calls Moses at the burning bush. That's the chapter when Moses finds out the information that's going to change his life forever, the destiny that's going to change his life forever, the plan that God has had in mind for him that's going to change his life forever. And of course, we all know what happened after that. God doesn't act in Moses' life until the moment when everyone least expects it. And that's what matters in this forgotten outlaw period of Moses' life. This 2-decade-long sojourn in Midian where he was tending sheep and trying to forget that he had ever lived in Egypt. 20 years where Moses is completely indistinguishable in the archaeological record from every other peasant herdsman that ever lived in the Middle East. And there were a lot of them.
Can I say something?
Go ahead.
Even from the first time that you mentioned sheep, that's another indication for me, before you even read these next passages, that God has been working with this all along. He didn't put them with the goats, he put them back with the sheep. You know, and you think about the Lamb of God and all through it. So God's been playing and manipulating this all along. It wasn't just any old thing that he was doing in all those years. He was back tending sheep.
That's right. Know? That's right.
Yeah, and let me build on that. Can I add something to that?
Sure, go ahead. Go ahead, Edie. Go ahead.
That follows something that I've been thinking the whole time. I think his mother prayed for him. I think his mother put him in God's care. And so I'm not a bit surprised that God's been looking out for him all this time.
I agree, Edie.
Well, that's where each of you come in, is that, you know, we all have different perspectives on this story. We all have different ideas about this story. I don't know where each of you is at in your life tonight. I don't know if you feel like you've got everything figured out, or if you feel like a screw up, or if you feel somewhere in between. And you don't have to share. I will not require you to share where you feel like you're at.
I need to learn a lot.
But You know,
but we
there were a
always-
lot of shepherds who probably looked at Moses and thought, wow, you know, that guy had a lot of advantages and he just threw them all away. But when God looked at Moses, he saw something special. He saw something important. And I think that's what we learned from the second chapter of Exodus and from this outlaw period of Moses' life. It has something to teach all of us. If we're on top of the world, it teaches us that maybe God can really only speak to us properly when we humble ourselves. Maybe we learn that success in the eyes of the world and success in God's eyes aren't the same thing, or even often the same thing. And if you're feeling down and out tonight, if you're feeling like a screw up, if you're feeling like you don't know where you're going, just know that just like Moses 3,200 years ago, God sees something really special in you too.
but
That's
the-
all
the-
I got.
Yeah, the thing is that God is always there and he can always interject. That's God.
It's true.
Mhm.
You know, what's been missing in tonight's discussion is that God is God, all knowing,
Yeah.
all, you know.
That's true, Jenny. You're right. You're right. God is all knowing and all powerful.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm impressed that the second 20 years he was steadfast and he stayed with his family and he stayed with his adopted land and stayed with those people, and he settled in.
I think he stayed because he was happy. I think he was happy with his identity. I think he was happy just sort of being an anonymous guy. He didn't want to be special. He just sort of wanted to live his life. But then, you know, like Jenny said, God is all-knowing and all-powerful, and God broke into his life and changed the direction of his life in that moment. And, you know, we don't know from the story if there were other Israelites who were given the chance to be who Moses ended up being. You know, we see that in the Bible sometimes. We see it in the story of Jonah, where God goes to people and people say like, I'm not interested in that. Moses didn't do that. We don't know why he didn't do it. He tried to offer some excuses and God would not be deterred. But I think part of the reason why God would not be deterred is because there was some part of Moses that was open to it, or he never would have accepted in the end.
Yeah. Dylan, I have a question. Do
Sure.
we know if Midian was his actual destination? Is that on that long trek? Was he headed for that's where I want to go, or did he just get stopped there?
I don't know. I wasn't there. But
No.
This is just my personal opinion, is that he, like I said, he was deliberately headed there because it was outside of the limits of Egyptian control.
Okay.
He wanted to evade justice, and he wasn't confident about his ability to do that within the Egyptian empire, so he had to get outside of it.
Oh, he was terrified of being killed. Pharaoh said he was going to kill him.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So that was a priority to him, is making sure that he wasn't held accountable for what he'd done, and so he got out of town.
Dylan, I was wondering about later on down the line as the story goes, it seems to me that he had a fairly good relationship with his father-in-law as opposed to some of the other patriarchs that we knew about, because it seems to me that, if I'm recalling correctly, that his father-in-law helped him to divide and establish a division of labor so that he wouldn't be so overwhelmed. And so I think that shows that he had a good relationship and he also listened.
That's true, Deb. Yeah, he he did have a very good relationship with his father-in-law, and his father-in-law was also a priest. And I think it's possible that maybe spending time, my theory, which again I can't prove, it's just my theory, is that spending time with Jethro kind of rubbed off on him and made him open to listening to God when God was ready to talk with him. We don't know a lot specifically about Jethro's religious beliefs, though. He is mentioned in the Bible as being a priest, number one. He is mentioned as making a sacrifice to the God of Israel at one point. We also do know that there's another famous example in the Bible of when the Midianites sacrificed to idols. We don't know if Jethro was ever involved in something. I mean, in that specific instance, Jethro was probably dead at that point. But we don't know if he was ever involved in idol sacrifice. So it may have been that he revered Israel's God among other gods that he also worshipped. His religious beliefs are ambiguous based on what we know in the Bible. All right. I feel like we've reached a good stopping point. I want to respect your time. I would love to continue to chat about this. Lindsay, my girlfriend, can attest that I literally could talk about this stuff all day long. There's like a few things in my life I can talk about all day long. I can talk about the Bible all day long. I can talk about the ancient world all day long. So, I mean, you guys all know where I work. So if you're ever interested, like seriously, come on down. Totally fine. Like I said at the beginning, I have a book that's hopefully coming out someday about this stuff. I have shared it for free with some people in this parish, including some people on this call. One person on this call. Actually, no, two people on this call. A third person on this call got one chapter. Anyway, I'm happy to share it as long as it's being distributed for free. So if you guys loved this chat and want to read more about Moses, I am happy to print you off a copy anytime. For now, I think we got to go. So why doesn't someone pray us out? Anybody feeling inspired to do that? Deb, yes, I see your hand. Deb, go right ahead.
From the Book of Common Prayer, prayer number 58. O God, by whom the meek are guided in judgment, and light riseth up in darkness for the godly, grant us in all our doubts and uncertainties the grace to ask what thou wouldst have us to do, that the spirit of wisdom may save us from all false choices, and that in thy light we may see light, and in thy straight path may not stumble, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
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 Amen. Thank you, Deb, so much. That was beautiful. I really appreciated that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan. This has been really fun and
Give us another class.
We can have more.
I want a copy of the book, please.
Oh yeah, okay. I'll make one for you. Don't worry. All right, everyone. Thank you so much.
God bless you all.
God bless you guys. Thank you for coming.
Good night.